waaw kon balaa professeur Mamadou Fall di jël kàddu bi pour defaree leen waxtaan bi ñu jox docteur Insa Touré mi nga xam te ne moom histoire générale du Sénégal la bokk moom ci centre bi la bokk si Visite si histoire du Sénégal bi la bokk ñu koy dalal moom loolu ñu ko wax ci welcome yéen la ñuy wax welcome xam nañ tamit centre bi seen centre donc di jox docteur kàddu bi.
Yeah. Good morning. On behalf of the University of Gambia Vice Chancellor, the Governing Council, the Dean, School of Arts and Science, the faculties, and the students. First of all, we would like to thank Professor Fall, who is our erudite scholar in African history, especially in Senegambia. General History of Senegal is an organization established to explore Senegalese history within the framework of Greater Senegambian history. And that is why since 2010-11, we have been collaborating with the University of St. Anta Diop and the Center. We were first invited in 2014 with Professor Bojang and to come and actually participate in the launching of General History of Senegal in 2014. And then I was inspired, and I believe that it's through collaboration we can do something for Senegambian history from our own perspective. And Professor Fall has been very, very instrumental, committing and demonstrating his interest in the Senegambian history, especially those areas focusing on the Gambia, and see how he could actually design a framework to see how we could actually perceive one another within the actually common historical context. And that's why we cannot actually isolate him. And he's also was a part-time lecturer. We can say he's also a part-time lecturer of the University of Gambia. He taught the last master's class on migration and boundary. I think Jim and Reverend were his students in those classes, and successfully he actually did his exam, and the grade was actually forwarded to the University of Lisbon. So I believe that the governments have their part to play in terms of enhancing integration. I have the belief that the government, that is government of the Gambia, government of Senegal, Guinea-Bissau, they have their role at the political level or at the macro level. But to actually put the integration into reality, I think it can be enhanced through inter-university collaboration. And this has been our major focus and theme. And this is what actually, since we start, I just said, okay, I ask myself, what can we do as universities? Two universities, what could they do in terms of actually implementing the transformation or integration to reality? I started actually co-opting some of them to teach online because the distance is not, spatial distance is not important anymore. But the electronic means actually brought us together in the new technological world system. It is important that we are bringing our semester classes to be lectured by professors from Sheikh Anta Diop and the General History. He's a faculty member and a senior faculty of the University of Sheikh Anta Diop. We can say he's also becoming an emeritus professor very soon. He spent most of his life teaching and also ensuring that Senegalese or Senegambian histories are documented. So why today I bring you here so that you will be inspired. You will be inspired about the success and the achievement of Senegal in scholarship, in academy, in heritage. We went to actually Gore Island and we were amazed and inspired on how Senegalese government committed to what is called preservation of heritage. Because Atlantic islands are very, very important. They are there as material basis to actually determine our contribution in the world system. They were the major linking space that connected us to what is called capitalist world system in the 15th century. That does not mean that we were not actually part of the world system. We were part of the world system before the emergence of Europe in the global system. Europe was actually within the continental confinement. They could not manipulate the technology to move out. But the means that could have been manipulated or explored to reach out to other parts of the world were not actually invented. And Africa was actively taking part through Trans-Sahara, that is territorial or terrestrial form of linkage in the world system. So we were never ever onlookers in the globalization, not so. In fact, we were actively participating in the globalization before Western Europe. We were connected with the Middle East through North Africa. Our goods and whatever services were going down to India and other parts of the world. So in order to actually expand the horizon, we have to actually come out of our Gambian jurisdiction to meet our experienced and experts who can actually impart deeper knowledge. And that's why today Professor Fall has been very, very instrumental. And he likes University of the Gambia students. And he likes University of the Gambia. So let's do everything to make sure that whatever we are learning from here, you actually adopt it in your life. And then we pray that this kind of bond, that is the link between the University of Gambia and Sheikh Anta Diop and this particular center, will be actually translated into reality. We need monetary zone. If Sahel zone is successful in implementing monetary union, not so, I think the Senegambian zone, because Senegambia is a byproduct of Sahelian zone, not so, in the ancient history. Like, for example, I told you about Ghana Empire and the origin of the Wolof people from Wagadu, led by Amari Gunfal. Not so? So you can understand that Sahel people this area completely. And if Sahel is successful in the establishment of monetary zone and Senegambia being the periphery or suzerain of the Sahelian zone on the Ghana Empire, on the Mali Empire, on the Songhai Empire. They conquered this area and ruled. So now, what are we going to get? The Senegambian area has all the cultural conditions, integration. You speak Wolof, I speak Wolof, they speak Mandinka. So what is there now? It's just governments to come together and implement one monetary zone. And that would be a kind of a foundation or pilot project for entire African unification. And I believe that being an expert in African boundaries and migration, today he will deliver a very powerful lecture on that. On that note, I really appreciate your comment and your commitment to whatever we are actually fighting for this region. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Assalamu alaikum to all. It's bad I don't speak Mandingo. I would love to be able to make a conference in Mandingo, or even Wolof. I guess many of you don't speak Wolof now. Actually, I tried it in Chahantu Diop University. I once came in the classroom, and out of the blue, I told my students, hey, let's make this lecture in Wolof. And we actually did it, and it worked very well. The conversation was good, the discussion was interesting and very deep. So I think there is something we have to work on in terms of which language we would elect when it comes to talk about our common history, because we are talking about the exact same history. I'm glad to meet some of my Gambian students, Reverend Jim, and the other member of that master group. It was quite an interesting class and experience for me. And I will extend the conversation we had over these last month or weeks to this group, because it's the same topic, it's the same conversation, it's the same history, it's the same questions I'm raising since now more than 40 years. For 40 years, we've been talking about these issues. And I used to present this conversation through three paintings, three drawings. I think the Reverend here is familiar with my language on those topics. When I talk about drawing, I'm talking about a general schema that can allow you to grasp a historical moment. And in the lecture we shared, I presented two different paintings. The one European drew for our history, and the one we drew for ourselves. What is coming from the imaginary geography of Europe, and what stemmed from our internal local dynamics. Those are the two aspects, the two drawing one can present in order to have a full understanding of Senegambian history, African history in general, but Senegambian history most of all. But I would add a third layer. I would add a third drawing, a third painting. I would call the silent transformation of Senegambia. My dear friend Insa was talking about what we already did in terms of inter-university collaboration. We were talking about the common heritage we have. I think those are already the signs and the elements that show that something is happening. We are not yet conscious of that silent transformation, but something is definitely happening. beyond the cooperation, the academic cooperation, beyond the common heritage, I will lay out some very important aspects that show how Senegal and Gambia are experiencing silent changes in terms of building the common future. I will address that third part, but let's go with Reverend. I think you will not hear something new because we already addressed this issue in class. I will just extend it to our student here. As an historian, we are not really familiar with the way history was written. We are not really familiar. We are familiar with the sense of talking about the past, the sense of writing about the past, but how that past was written for us, I think we are not used to think about it because it's something very subtle. We are not even concerned about the extent our mind and way of thinking were informed by what I call the geographic imagination of Europe. What I'm trying to tell you here is what we always considered as our history, as our own history, was but imagination created by Europeans. I will try to lay out that part, and you will see that it's something very deep in our understanding of African history. And yet, it's not really African history. It's how African history was written and drawn from Europe. And this has so a strong grip, so a deep grip in our mind that we don't even think about it. Let's talk about that imagine. I think that part I could just give the floor to the Reverend to present that part because we had a very interesting discussion on those aspects. When we talk about African history, I just mentioned that we are not dealing with African history. We were dealing with the way Europeans thought about African history. And this goes way beyond the origin of modern time. The origin of modern time. I'm talking about the first century. The first century of in our common history. Right at the beginning, when Europeans thought about Africa, they never thought about that continent that is the cradle of humanity, that continent where humanity was invented, that continent where humanity developed and spread all over the world, because that's the real Africa. That's the real Africa. That's the Africa created by history. That's the Africa reality carved in the long run of history. But yet, the European thought of Africa as a triangle. And we have many scholars, many, let's say, geographers and historians in the antique world using the concept of a triangle. We have it in the work of Strabo, in the work of Pomponius Mela, in the work of Eratosthenes. They thought of Africa as a triangle. And that triangle, it's bad I don't have a map here, but you can imagine a right triangle where one side is correspond with the Mediterranean and the other side is East Africa. Those parts of the world, those parts of the continent was really known because Greek, Persian, and Roman managed to visit and describe those parts of Africa. But Strabo himself said that when it comes to the other side of that triangle, meaning the part beyond the Strait of Gibraltar, Strabo said that he knew nothing about that side of Africa. And that side of Africa is the part corresponding with Senegambia. What I'm trying to tell you here is Senegambia was the missing link of world history in European mind. And when people ask about the people from Senegambia, Strabo said that those parts of the world are the domain of goddess and monsters. And the people he described in Africa was people with heads dog. That's the imagery developed by Europeans right at the beginning of the first century. And that's the root of bigotry, that's the root of racism, that's the root of contempt people developed about Africa and West Africa since the origin, since the first century of our. And you know, you have the echo of that cultural contempt in many books and even in many scriptures. The Reverend knows what I'm referring to. So that's the first level, that's the first moment where Africa was portrayed, West Africa was portrayed as a no man's land occupied by monsters and people with the face of a dog. And fast forward, we come to the 15th century. The 15th century was the decisive moment where the imaginary geography of Europe developed and was considered as African history. What happened in the 15th century? What happened in the 15th century is, Portugal was known as this big power who really conquered the world, discovered America, Brazil, and the West African coast. But people have tendency to overlook one aspect about Portuguese history. Portugal is actually a very weak state. Because when Portugal was discovering or opening the seas and coming to Africa and America, the king of Portugal didn't really control its own land, because 2/3 of his national land was detained by the nobility. And what happened in Portugal is the nobility who partook the reconquest of Portugal from the Arabs took all the available lands in Portugal. Doing so, the lower nobility has no possibility to access to land. And what the king of Portugal did is giving to that young nobility lands that never existed. Or he decided to give to the young nobilities areas, lands that are supposed to exist beyond the Cabo Verde island, that means Senegambia, but they never put any foot in Senegambia, in those places. What I'm trying to describe here is right at the 15th century, way before even entering Senegambia, European already put Senegambia within the frame of feudal Portugal. That means that Senegambia was considered as land to be conquered, land to be dominated within the framework of European domination, and not even setting their feet in Senegal. So this is a second element where we see how European considered and organized on a mere graphic level, organized Senegambia and put it within the framework of European feudalism. Fast forward in the same century, European artists and architects designed a world where Senegambia is already seen as something observed from a distance. They invented a methodology of drawing that will go all over the world. And in that methodology, called the perspective, the linear perspective, they managed to put Europe in the center where every drawing and every look, every gaze of the world stem from Europe. And the invention of the new painting system, the new mechanic painting in the 15th century, spread that image all over the world. I'm not sure you are following here, because this is a very important moment where even before setting any foot here in Senegambia, Senegambia was already seen as a land observed from afar, that European can control, that European can submit and put in a subaltern position. The rest of the story, you know it. Because after, then colonialism came, then slavery came. But before colonialism and slavery, that part of the African continent was already submitted within a general schema drawn from the geographic imaginary. And that's very subtle. That's very subtle. And that's definitely, that explains why generally African people are always thinking of Europe in terms of a hierarchy, where Europe is on the top and Africa on the bottom. And you see, another moment will come in 1648. What happened in 1648? It was the Conference of Westphalia. In Westphalia, what happened is Europeans met in order to try to solve the war they had in terms of religious conflict and discussion and contest on land. And they found this solution, accepting that from now on, every sovereignty, every power should be bounded by boundaries in the territory. They invented the territory based on the specific reality of Europe in the 15th century. And they decided that every sovereignty in all over the world should be within the limits of the boundary. And what happened here is what was specific to European history would be considered like a universal model. And look, even today, we are still within the framework of the Westphalian concept of territory. I can keep on along those lines and talk to you how the model of these imaginary geographies developed in modern history and how we so lazily adopted them as our model of history because we didn't claim it, but look how dependent we were in framing our own history. In framing our own history, look, when you use a map, Europe is always in the north, in the map we are using. When you talk about sovereignty, when you talk about identity, we use two words. We always get from European tradition. We are incapable of getting out the heritage of Westphalia. Meaning, every time we talk about our sovereignty, our states, our sovereignties and our states are always within the limitation of the territory and boundaries. And every time we are talking about our identity, we always think of identity in terms of ethnicity. And those two concepts stemmed from that imaginary geography I was referring to. So I think that I can keep on talking about these issues, but now I think you really grasp, you really understand that what I was talking about was not really African history, was not really African trajectory, was not really African or Senegambian history. It was definitely how Europe drew that history within an imaginary framework. That's not history. That's not history. And it's until now, our books, our maps, our way of thinking of our identities are still within that lens. Until now, nobody here can think in terms of identity or nationality beyond the limitation of boundaries and ethnicity. Why? That's not our heritage. That's something we borrow from that European imaginary. How can you draw your own history using concept borrowed from a foreign imaginary? That's not possible. And that may explain why we have difficulty to understand what is really linking Senegal and Gambia, what is really linking Senegal and Mali, or I'm talking about Senegal, but I can say the exact same thing between Gambia and Mali, between Gambia and Bissau. Within the lens of territoriality, there is no way we can understand our common history. No way. So, this is the first drawing I'd like to present. I think when you get out of this class, my goal is for you to realize that what you always thought was the right concept, the right determination, the right definition of our history was in fact something we borrowed from a foreign epistemology or a foreign imaginary, not even epistemology, because it was an imaginary. Who decided that in everywhere in the world, Europe has always to be on the top? That's not God's decision. That's something they decide for themselves, and we took it for granted. So I think let's put that part of Senegambian history within the heritage of Europe and let's forget about it. And now, what do we have to put as stemming from our own history? Because it's easy to say, whoa, it's European imaginary. But we are compelled to write our own history. How can we do it? If we dismiss the concept and categories borrowed from European imaginary. The appropriate answer would be to just ask the question to our local language. Because local language speak volume about the reality of our history. Whether you are a Mandingo, a Fulbe, a Wolof, a Jola, there is always in your own language a wording that refer to what is identity, what is commonalities, what is what we share as a common identity. There is a wording for that. But in those wording, you will never find something like a territorial state. I challenge you about that. I will challenge you to see that you will never find something like ethnicity. You know, this is a debate. People here are familiar with that conversation here. Many ethnic groups, many people here in Senegal are claiming, and are even fighting with me about and telling me that you are denying people the right to be an ethnic group. And this is the way to show you the grip of European mythology in our mind. People are claiming their belonging, their belonging, no, not belonging, their inclusion within a frame that has nothing to do with their own history, that they get from people from outside, from an imaginary borrowed to European tradition, and they are claiming it. I'm mad with you because you are denying me my ethnicity. Yes, I'm denying you your ethnicity because ethnicity was a colonial construct. It was a colonial construct. Now, if you are Mandingo, how you define the traditional communities? You will use the word kafu. My fellow students, what is the other word in Mandingo you gave me to as an equivalent of kafu? The Reverend is no longer here, but there is another word in Mandingo. I think it's Gabilo, no? I wrote it down.
Kabilo is what?
No. We were talking about the kafu, and there was another word you gave me. Huh?
In Mandinga.
Yeah, in Mandinga. Yeah, actually, it was the Reverend who gave me that wording. But anyway, I don't speak Mandinga. But what is important here is that we have our own wording and our own concept in terms of defining our collective identity. Yeah, that is our collective identity. We have it. We have Kafu in Mandingo. We have Tengsoba in Mosi. We have Laman in Wolof, Laman in Serer. We have Lamu in Fulani. We have Dugu. Kompil.
Company is not there. Like
Kompin.
No,
We have many wording because what is important here is to notice that our own language managed to draw our collective identity, and that's important. And what is the common denominator of those wording? Kafu, Jamane in Soninke, Lamu. The common denominator is these are collective identity that are not organized within the compound of the political boundary, but these are collective identity organized around land and rituals. All the names you can find in local languages referring to collective identities always stem from how land was organized and distributed and how rituals were developed. So the power and community organization were always based on land and, and rituals. And this created a local dynamics we found in all of Africa. And that has nothing to do with the territorial scope European drew for us. And I used to portray myself as a Marxist in another life when I was younger. When I was younger, when we were talking about our societies, when we were referring to our history, we used to use the concept borrowed to Marx and Engels about class struggle, territorial state, nationalism, etc., etc. And we realized that those concepts, even developed by Marx and Engels, belong to that geographic imaginary of Europe. Because all the concepts used by Marx was borrowed to the experience of England in the 19th century, where you can find different classes like the bourgeoisie, the proletariat, and their class, their struggle is really the very dynamics and the very driven force of history. But when it comes to our own history, what is the driving force? You cannot talk about class struggle between bourgeoisie and proletariat where there is no bourgeoisie and no proletariat. That's not possible. And yet, my generation used to spend nights and days discussing about the struggle in Senegal between proletariat and bourgeoisie, and yet it was European history we were referring to. Yeah, definitely. And what is the driving force? The driving force of our history, whether it is in Senegal, Gambia, Mali, Burkina Faso, wherever you can go in West Africa, there is some common identity, common driving force. It's always people from cereal-based agriculture that are seeking available lands, that are migrating from north to south. And in that movement, nomad with their encounter with sedentary people, nomad sedentary. That movement is the driving force of African history. You know, I've been studying this for more than 30 years. And I managed to draw some, let's say, combination between local population. You will see between Moor, Berber, and Wolof, Fulbe and Soninke, Bambara and Marka. You'll see that on a historical point of view, their identity and collective identity always stemmed from the encounter between nomad and sedentary. And this is the historical driving force of West Africa. And yet, we have to think about how that movement, that historical driving force, really developed and drew our local history. And when you think about that aspect, you will never try to see the part played by war, the part played by ethnic struggle, etc. Because those can exist, but those were not really the driving forces of our history. So, in order to see what is the real driving force of our history, let's think about the encounter between nomad and sedentary. There is another driving force. If you are a Fulani, for instance, you may heard of the term Munde. If you are a Mandingo, you heard about the terms Berinindo. Berinindo is a movement, a north-south movement developed for millenaries, for herders, seeking salt. They left the north and they went to the Atlantic shore in order to look for salt. And that historical drive was most of the time developed by the Fulanis. And those movement was really international movement because they would go from Mauritania, actual Mauritania, to Sierra Leone. And we have actually many evidences showing that Almada in the 15th century is talking about that movement, that Munde movement, and until now, those movements are still developing. And those dynamics has created north-south movement from Fulanese, exchanging, settling down, mingling, being in a reciprocal relationship with Serer, with Mandingo, with Fulbe, with Soninke, from the origin until today. And yet, you will not find those elements, those references in the traditional books. We already we notice the way Islam was spread in West Africa. Islam was spread through the movement of some clerics, not by war, but some clerics, some Soninke clerics, and then some Mandingo clerics, some Moorish clerics. They developed movements all over West Africa, settling down, creating villages, and those movements has nothing to do with boundaries. Those movements always ignored boundaries. So that was also an element of the local dynamics. We have also the movement developed by the hunters. You know, people have tendency to forget something very important in our history, the role played by hunters. People have tendency to forget that even many of the Mandingo settlements in Gambia, Badibu, Nyomi, Nyani, Wuli, those at the origin were settled by hunters. And those hunters created some network of polities that still developed within colonial period and has developed into really collective identity in West Africa. I will not talk about the role of caravans. Caravans also ignored the borders. I talked about the clerics movement. Yes, so what I was trying to explain here is for centuries, African population mingled, connected, and developed steady relationship, ignoring the existence of borders. always said that I have more than 35 or 40 years experience in Senegambian history, but I'm sorry, I never met a border, a historical border. Yes, now we know that between Senegal and Gambia, after Berlin, people drew borders. But before, never, never. You'll see some scholars trying to find something like that can look like borders, but real borders, never. And even the way polities were organized. I was discussing with my fellow students in Gambia about how the polities were organized, and even the way our polities were organized. Let's take the example of Wallo, as I mentioned. Well, Wallo, because Wallo is one of the primary polity in Senegambia, and Wallo was organized in a concentric way, stemming from one capital, Jurbel, and around Jurbel, the first ring occupied by the the brothers of the king, called the Barak. Then another layer uh, were settled the allies, people in alliance with the central power. And then a fourth layer, like a no man's land. But never in those or in that kind of organization did we find something like a border. What I'm trying to tell you is, give the example of Waro, is our polities had centers, capitals, and areas around the capital, then a second layer, but the fourth layer is a no man's land, where sometimes even the king has no possibility to control anything. There is no border in that configuration. And yet, we have tendency to study our traditional polities using the concept of borders. Um, you see, just to try to sum up what I just presented, I presented to you two set of drawing. The one referring to the the imagination of Europeans, I call it the imaginary geography, and the one stemming from local dynamics that explain how for centuries African was exchanging, settling down, and creating communities, but not experiencing separation by borders. Never. And you know how the history was developed, how history unfolded. When we got our independence, instead of claiming the traditional heritage about the kind of organization where there is no boundary, the kind of organization where people were together, creating community, developing economic ties, academic ties, because what we are trying to do, this was done for millenaries between Senegal and Gambia, between Mauritania and Gambia, between Mali and Senegal. So we are not inventing anything. But when we claimed our independence in the 1960s, what happened? Instead of creating or claiming those ensembles, we went separate within the framework of territories. And everybody remembered what Sheikh Anta Diop said. Cheikh in 1950 wrote that we have to be careful. We have to be careful what we are heading to. Because if we go to independence within the framework of the imagination of Europe, meaning within the territorial state framework, it will be too late. Africa will never experience development. Africa will never experience unity. Africa will never experience emancipation. Never. He said that in 1950. And he said that if we don't go straight to claim our commonalities in history, commonalities in language, commonalities in the way we organize ourselves traditionally. If we don't go straight to our federal destiny, it will be too late. Because what will happen is the heritage of the imagination of Europe will settle down and remain in our head, remain in our politics. And that's exactly what happened. We went to independence separately, Gambia, Senegal, Mauritania, etc., etc. But now, everybody is aware of the fact that this is a misleading track. We are not going anywhere within that framework. Look, 65 years of independence, and we are still lagging in condition where we experience physical physical poverty in terms of infrastructure, in terms of even freedom, in terms of democracy, in terms of education. We are still lagging in those areas that are very important in the development of the country. Why? Because we are weak states competing to one another. And you see, uh, you, we are really competing instead of going straight to our federal destiny, as Sharon Job was claiming it in 1950. And now what happened? We realize that this is an impasse. And we all understand that. We all realize that this is a misleading track. And people understand that if we keep on along those tracks, we will never realize. And look, just have a look on one point. If you try to list the most important challenge of our time, for instance, employment, for instance, the circulation of weapons, global warming, those challenges, if you look properly, you will realize that those challenges would never be solved by the kind of states we have. Why? Because those challenges are long-term challenges, and our states have a short-term agenda. Every one of our states, their agenda is between maybe 5 or 7 years as a mandate. How can you solve those decisive issues if you just have those limited times, those limited agenda, uh, political agenda? So everybody realized that this is not going anywhere. So now is the time to change. Now is the time to change. And what is happening, no matter how you can call it, what is happening is but us dismissing the heritage of the European imaginary. Because the territory we claimed as the matrix of our identity when we went to independence, because independence was just that, claiming that we have to exert our sovereignty, our identity within boundaries. That was really the very meaning of independence. Now we are realizing that in order to progress, in order to realize our freedom, our independence, we should go beyond territory. And we should definitely deterritorialize. And that's exactly what is happening. I will finish on those notes to show you really what is happening. That's what I was referring. How many minutes I have left? No, that's perfect. What is really happening? Remember, right at the beginning, I told you about a silent transformation. Something is happening, and something good, very good is happening, but we are not aware of that. That's why I'm talking about silent transformation. The silent transformation is people are getting out of territory. That's happening, but nobody is claiming it because it's not in tune with the politically correct. Everyone, every power, every government want to control its sovereignty. But what is happening is very deep. And I kind of realized that not too long ago, studying these matters, what is happening on the borders. Guys, something very good is happening along our borders. We were losing our time how do you call it? Sticking on boundaries, but local population are stepping away from those boundaries. That's exactly what is happening. You go between Senegal and Gambia. Do you know that there are Senegalese villages that are, no, tell me, hear me out. Senegalese villages with Senegalese people that are within the, definitely. Not only Gambian, no, not only Gambian currency, but even Gambian administration. Are you following me? This is something very important. That means that beyond the differences of states and boundaries, etc., population, local population are taking matters in hands and are doing, in terms of currency, you run, but mostly in terms of even administration. Senegalese villages are administrated by Gambian people. That's the reality. But there is more. There is more. I discovered between Senegal and Mali, that Senegalese army often make patrols within Mali. And Senegalese army are doing patrol. And this is an agreement.
Yeah.
This is
security part. Yeah.
definitely this is a security part that is developing on the border. And that shows that something is happening, but nobody is talking about it. No, nobody is talking about it. Huh? Definitely. And there is a great historian, you may know him, Alpha Omar Konare from Mali. He developed the concept of le terme en français, pays frontière, border country, something like that, border country. Well, I'm translating it from French. Pays frontière, meaning that local population would take matters in hand, having a common policy on health, on education, on security, and on how to control the environment, etc., etc. So that is happening. So what is happening now is that's why I'm talking about the silent transformation. intellectuals and political personnel are not aware of that. But local population are ahead developing those. But even the politicians now are aware of that. Look what is happening. Two aspects. Prime Minister Sonko went to Sierra Leone, and now he's talking about the Steel Road. The Steel Road, meaning creating a connection from Sierra Leone to Dakar. Sierra Leone would produce the iron, and the steel will be developed in Senegal. Imagine what it will bring from Sierra Leone, because Guinea is within that framework. Gambia is within that framework. Bissau is within that framework. And that's the way to go. And this is a silent transformation that is unfolding. You know, there is an organism we call here Puma, who is developing the sustainable development on the territory, on the borders, developing electricity, uh, developing connectivities in terms of infrastructure. That is happening, and that's a good thing. That means that instead of putting ahead the heritage of European imaginary, we are now claiming the heritage of our traditional dynamics. And that's the real thing, that's the real deal. That's really what makes me very optimistic in terms of African Union, in terms of even Pan-Africanism. That would be the last point. Pan-Africanism was sought in terms of a continental thing, where we have to unite different states within the continent. But that has nothing to do with the original Pan-Africanism. Because the original Pan-Africanism, as it was developed by Wilmot Blyden, it was an hemispheric Pan-Africanism, linking America, Africa, and even Asia. You know, I have here a document written by Wilmot Blyden. I will not, it's a little bit long. I will share it with you. He described, I think it was in 1987, he described the reality of Africa and the diaspora in the 19th century. And you will be amazed to see that within that framework, there were no boundaries. There was no such thing like a territorial state. And African local population were yet together in a hemispheric relationship from America to Asia. And now history is coming back to that heritage. Look what is happening now. People are seeking maybe the cooperation with China to reclaim that heritage. Look what is happening. What is happening is we are developing a sense of collective collaboration from West Africa to Asia, developing infrastructure, developing academic connections, developing businesses, developing, we just mentioned the Steel Road, and this is the way of the future. And you see how Pan-Africanism is really reclaiming the heritage of the local dynamics of this continent. Thank you very much.
Let's have a second applause for Professor Visite. That's why I said it is important to merge out of our confinement or territorial confinement that continues to constrain us in so many ways. If you look at or listen to him thematically, you will understand that he's talking about what are we claiming what we are claiming now, it doesn't really belong to us. Why? Because Gambia as a geopolitical zone in the modern time was not actually created by Gambians. It was created and designed to respond to the demands of those who were far away from us. And you know, when they were designing Gambia, they were not thinking of the cultural realities and geography. Gambia was designed because European British were only interested in war, were only interested in River Gambia. To utilize River Gambia to facilitate the transportation of their finished goods to the hinterland. They were not interested in land because they were not here for land, they were here for trade. And why French space or territory was actually bigger than Gambia because why? Because there was actually an intense demand for peanut oil in France around 1838. So based on that, France was actually designing territories in order to actually control more land for cultivation, more land for production. So you can understand these people were maritime and these people were territorial or terrestrial area. Great. And we are now claiming those areas that were only created to respond to their economy. Yes, Gambia, I'm Gambian. Did you design Gambia? It was designed against the will of your grandfather. And Senegal was designed against the will of our grandfathers. So what are we claiming now? What he is talking about, let's go back to our primordial context and framework. Let's study it very, very well. And he is talking about the emerging unconsciously. It is going on, but we are not conscious of it. But we understand that local people are conscious of the realities of their commonalities and they are actually putting it into reality. You know, like for example in Gunjur, in Gambia, the environmentalists are entering into Abenna. Janna in Casamance are confronted, helping their co-environmentalists. So you can understand that people are actually going beyond the physical boundary. They are now going reflecting on their primordial state or condition to do what? To actually foster unity. And I believe that in 5 or 10 years' time, the government will adopt it as a framework and eventually something that we will never expect will happen in Africa. And this should, I consider this thing as a divine intervention. I'm telling you. Look, we've been coming to this place, Dr. Job, here, almost 15 years now, or 10 years. But I've not been thinking of what I am even doing. I didn't know. I have not been conscious of what I am doing. And you have not been conscious of what you are doing. We are now defying all the concept of boundaries, but we want to come together in order to actually create a condition that reflects our primordial realities. I think one of the framework he actually designed for you to go back and think about it. Let's not think of this Senegalese, this is Gambia. For what? I think we need to reflect now. Non-retail societies within border are now coming back together to say boundaries are not ours. Not so? Even in the religious area or whatever, you know, the people are coming to Makkah. we have Gambian Bifals, Gambian Tijanias, connecting to major centers in Tivaouane and whatever. So you can understand that people don't care. What they care is what actually connected them before the creation of it. So it's a learning point for both historians and political scientists. Thank you very much. Any question you have? So we want to.
Just one more point.
Please.
I forget to mention, actually, Professor Ture reminded me of that. Why we are so used to identify ourselves in terms of division, in terms of separation. You are eager to say, I'm a Wolof, I'm a Mandingo, I'm a Gambian, I'm a Senegalese. Because we are used to that.
Yes, yes.
And we develop those tendencies from maybe the school system, for sure. I mentioned it because ask the Chinese to define themselves. Ask the Chinese to define himself. He will straight tell you, I'm from Chungo. Chungo is the center of the world. He thinks of himself as belonging to a country that is the center of the world, not the margin of the world. The same question you will ask it to an American. He is thinking of himself as belonging to a nation upon a hill. The nation, America is a nation upon a hill. Meaning that they think of themselves and their country as something never in the position of dominating country. But when it comes to us, we are always thinking of ourselves in terms of separated, weak, and dominated. Something has to change. Something has to change, definitely.
Thank you.
Thank you, Professor. Thank you for this presentation. My name is Awar Budak, political science student, University of Gambia. So, your presentation, we find it very interesting. And you talk about the silent transformation that the really population is doing. But at the government level, we've not seen these things happen in terms of cross-border movement of goods and services, free movement of people. For example, between Gambia and Senegal, I cannot bring certain things from Gambia and bring them to Senegal. Rice, oil, onion, and this has been there before I was born, many years, many decades. So we believe, as you said, the transformation is going right, but at the state bilateral level, it's not working. The ECOWAS free movement of people is not realistic. The African continental free trade area, like in fact they call it CELCAM, is not working. So how do we think the government can make this real? Not just the population, because the population cannot achieve it when the governments are in trade barriers. So can you talk about that, especially between Gambia and Senegal? How do you remove trade problem between them, barriers?
Thank you. I'm not sure when you were saying that it's not working on the government level, talking about the common market, it's not working. That is an pessimistic approach, I think. It's not maybe working properly, but look what is happening. Government themselves are getting out the territory. You know why? In Gambia, in both Gambia and Senegal, all our two governments are getting out of the territory because they are all claiming the necessity of integration. They are all part of ECOWAS, even if ECOWAS has its own problem. But the creation of ECOWAS in itself is a way to try to solve that problem. Maybe uh, they are not doing enough. Maybe we still have some resistance. But what is happening is the government are lagging, they are draining, they are dragging their feet, while the population are accelerating movement. So what is happening is, I'm not sharing that pessimism because both governments are doing their best to try to create common institutions and strengthen the the ECOWAS system. But that still road I was referring to, this is something new. This is not a political endeavor. This is an economic and very powerful undertaking. Sonko is championing. He is trying to create the road for steel, linking Senegal, Gambia, Bissau, Guinea, and Sierra Leone. I think that's the way to go. And the local government also are getting out of territory, developing what they call the decentralization movement. In Gambia and in Senegal, this is a central policy to try to give more leverage and more influence to local government. So that's the way to go, but I agree with you. Things are not going in the appropriate path. But I think that maybe very soon, if you combine both the silent transformation from below and the slow path of integration on the top, something will happen. And I'm pretty sure that that's the way to go because we have no other choice. So let's be optimistic. Let's be optimistic because if we have a government like the one we have here, well, I'm not throwing any to the Gambian government, but I'm pretty sure that there is a tendency in Africa, not only in West Africa, but on the whole continent. What is developing now is that we have governments that are thinking in terms of the interest of the majority and not being uh, dominated or controlled by foreign power. The government who is aware of the local and the national interest will go hand to hand and realize the integration from below and from the bottom. I'm an optimistic person. I think that's the way of the future. I'm not sure you are convinced, but no, no, we have no choice.
Already going on.
No, I'm telling you, something is happening. You go to the borders. But what we described right away, this is something we didn't invent. I was not even aware of that. This is something like an epiphany I discovered maybe 3 months ago.
Even
something is
Senegal or
happening.
Gambia.
Yeah.
Senegal or Gambia security.
And there is another layer you don't forget the role of the diaspora. We have Gambian diaspora and Senegalese diaspora all over the world. Those diaspora are trying to work together, develop projects together, and that's also is that's part of the deal. Imagine if the central government is doing the integration within ECOWAS and the steel road, for instance. And the local governments are developing those initiatives along the different borders. If you add another layer of the diaspora, I think there is a room for more optimism. So let's be optimistic.
So we did not answer one question. That is the trade between Gambia and Senegal, the embargo. You think they should remove that?
Oh, definitely. No, this is total nonsense. And let me just tell you, if they don't remove it, the population will do it. Because they will develop the smuggle, the smuggling system. I know, no, for sure. But this is a nonsense. This is a complete nonsense.
You're right. What happened right now when it comes to sugar and others? You see that some people, traders from Senegal, will smuggle sugar from the Gambia to Senegal. You can see how they respond to certain political situations when it comes to embargo on certain commodities from the Gambia. The Senegalese will come and Gambians also will go and bring. So which means the population don't care. Once the policy is actually instituted or adopted, people just actually do their own thing, where they will, you know that in Yomi, your own area, not so. Normally smuggle things into Yomi or from Yomi to Senegal. So what is trying to tell you is that I think the unification or whatever integration we are, it is gradually coming from the ordinary people. Ordinary population, that is the downtrodden people, are now implemented. And now it will be intense later, where the governments will now become sensitive to it and come together to develop a policy that will actually enhance the full-fledged integration process. Yeah. I know you people are very sensitive to it, but it will be over. But what is important right now, collectively we are conscious of our primordial commonalities. You understand what I mean here? For example, maybe your mother has relatives in Senegal, not so. Exactly. So we are interacting on daily basis. And right now, our Gambian women are coming to Kaulang to get vegetables on weekly basis. You see, what we need to study this thing right now because Prof actually has actually touched on something that we are not conscious of. So people need to look at the level of interaction.
Yep.
I think the level of interaction, bypassing the fiscal boundary designs. Yeah, thank you. Any question?
To add to that, and yesterday a police officer stopped us. I said that we did not follow the boss, our boss. So he offended the law of Senegal. So he took out the receipt. He said that he's going to charge us, and then we're going to pay the fine. So we are negotiating. We tell him that we are from Gambia, okay, and Gambia and Senegal we are the same. So the officer stepped back. He said, my mother is from Gambia. So he said that because of that, I'll not charge you. But next time, try and close and lock all the doors. Yes.
So subconsciously it is there, but we cannot actually, as scholars, cannot actually identify and come up with it. So now the prof is telling us that now let's study what is actually going on.
Yeah.
When it becomes part of our mind now, population will react
Sure.
and want to see that it is. I think this is a reality, not so.
No, I think that the embargo will not last.
Do not.
Because this is, I know that there is some negotiation around those matters, and we will definitely find the best solution. But this is really something out of the schema. I mean, this is not a normal process, because it's again against the rule within ECOWAS. It's against what all the two governments are claiming. So this has to stop. Sure.
Any question?
So,
Okay.
shortly before your submission ended, you touched on how Americans and Chinese often see themselves coming from one particular entity, and then from Africa now we're more obsessed or we focus more on as Dr. Demtue described it, our primordial ties. For example, if you ask me, I'll tell you my time, Canada, and let's say what I actually represent. So that I think is one of the reasons why development in comparison to Africa and other parts of the world was actually slow. For when it comes to, sorry, these are the questions, the contribution, by the way. So for when it comes to, sorry, let's say policies, development of anything, we focus more on how this affects our own regional or primordial ties rather than the country as a whole. I'll use my country as an example. In Sierra Leone, when it comes to like voting rights, if you're part of the SLPP, you are compelled, if you're a Mende, to vote for one of yours. I remember during the elections, after election, the one lady asked me, did you go and vote for this? And I was like, nah, I made my choice because I don't agree with this policy. This is one of the things that I believe actually compromises Africa. I don't subscribe to the idea that this protectionist idea of excluding Africa from the global market actually works. Because you touched on, let's say, bringing the iron ore from Sierra Leone, then processing it in Senegal, and then maybe trading to other parts of the world. Then it occurred to me that sometimes we actually don't need to process it here. Rather, we just need to sell it at a level where we make money. The United States, for example, they are the greatest exporters of corn flour. 79% of the world. So basically, sometimes when it comes to the resources in Africa, we tend to focus that these resources, we're not benefiting from it because the West or the Europeans come and take these resources and then make exorbitant profits. But I'm convinced that it actually has to come from the government because they grab these policies. Then when these monies come, they manage it badly. Donald Trump, when he came into office, one of the first things he did was tear up every trade agreement he had with other countries that do not agree with the American ideals. Whereas in Africa, when a particular president comes into office, he will first of all look at how will I be able to benefit my primordial community rather than the country as a whole. So I'm a strong subscriber of globalization because I believe the world has moved past the stage wherein Africa can develop on its own. Singapore went through it, China went through it, South Korea went through it, and I can believe for Africa, if we actually have to cross this bridge, as in take it to the next stage, we actually have to accept the fact that one, the world is very interconnected. It is too late to actually make that change. So the best thing we can do is handle it better. If we're actually going to sell our resources, let the money or the resources we get from those exports be able to benefit the people as a whole. And to do that, we have to make sure that all redundant people in governance or in policy making areas have to leave. And then in order to do that, ourselves seated here, we have to move along primordial ties when it comes to selecting these individuals and then thinking of Africa and our countries and Africa as a whole.
Thank you for your contribution. Thank you. Yeah, any question?
Yeah. Sorry.
Usman?
Yeah. The mic is
But you can.
yeah. You were told that Africa, like the civilization started in Africa, that Africans knew how to write from the get-go. And then today it's a pity that we don't have an original copy of the history of Africa. I wanted to know whether the Africans have written at the time the history of Africa. Per se, they are written and it was temporary. I wanted to know. But if so, or if they failed to write them, I wanted to know why they failed to write about Africa. And then my second phase of the question is that upon realizing that the history that is written was imaginative and then imposed to Africans, and then we are still reading that history. What is the step of the African historian towards that history that was imaginative, written and imposed on us? Was there any attempt to ban it and have open history? That's not
Good question. Yeah, thank you very much. The history of Africa, we have to bear in mind that even if the dominant feature of that writing is from or stem from the African heritage, I mean the European heritage, there is some attempt to go beyond the imagery of Europe. You mentioned that attempt in writing the general history of Africa. That was a good move. And what that initiative, what that initiative really developed as an outcome is, for the first time, we have African working together on the same historical framework. It's not that the history of the continent is only depending or only answering to the quest or the questions from Europe, but it's Africans themselves developing their own methodology within the same chronological framework. That's something very important. And in doing so, we are getting rid of the imaginary of Europe. Because remember, when you stick on European imaginary, you forget the real history of Africa. And you mentioned it. Africa is the cradle of humanity. That's, I used to tell to tell that to my student. There was one point in human history where there was only one history in the whole world, and it was the history of Black Africans. It's not a matter of bigotry or racism, but that's a historical fact. Humanity developed in Africa and spread in a diasporic way all over the world. That is history. And the history of Africa, we just have to describe that historical facts. We don't need to fight a lot because that's something obvious. We have documents, we have writings, we have archaeological artifacts that are proving that. So we don't need really to fight too much in order to achieve that goal. But you were right. That is a very question we have to discuss.
From the girls now, girls. Ladies, or what?
Okay, I understand that, okay, my name is Anshuman, I'm from Calcutta. Yes, well, from what you have said, it's very important. So you said there are steps that are taken in order to try to integrate African, especially Senegal. But
the space at which it is going. This is a very important move. Anyway, it's a very important move. But at the grassroots level, we are not seeing that effectiveness of this movement. Okay, and what is the steps now to make it more fast to the political, to the political level, so that they can also respond and then support our initiative to integrate our continent, our countries together.
I think this is a political matter. Uh, but I'm pretty sure of one thing. If every one of our government is showing real commitment for integration, for unity, and independence and emancipation, that will strengthen, that will also make it more faster the way to achieve. I have no doubt about that. The problem within ECOWAS is there is a difference in policy. You have some governments that are aware of the necessity to take the path of liberation, the path of emancipation. But we have many of them that are still willing to go along the expectation of foreign powers. So, and that is really what is stalling the process. But the process is, look what we have achieved from, we lost many decades, the rules, the rules of the World Bank. Let me just give you this example. There was a time where the World Bank asked Senegal, for instance, to not develop rice cultivation. I'm telling you, we had a moment in our history in the 80s where the World Bank was asking Senegal not to produce rice locally. because for the World Bank, it was easier to import rice. But now, look what is happening. The local government is now talking about rice sufficiency and is developing agriculture, developing the road of waters, etc. What they call the water highway, and that's the way to go. It's if you ask me how can we hasten that process, I would say it's up to you. Whenever you are from Gambia or Mali or wherever, make your government go the way it's supposed to go in order to achieve those goals. And that's exactly, I guess, what is happening in Senegal. We've been stalling for decades, copying France, following the rules of the World Bank, etc. But now we have a government who said, stop. Let's think of a way to fasten our emancipation, to fasten our economic development, and so on. Every country within Gambia, Mali, or elsewhere to just fasten that process. But that process is really happening. What I call the silent transformation, it's not only academic and economic, but it's also political. You are not seeing it because it's not so obvious, and someone mentioned it, saying that at the grassroots level, how it shows. But maybe it's a matter of communication. Maybe because people are more focused on what is happening in the capitals and in the big cities. But the reality is, at the grassroots level, people are developing agriculture. At the grassroots level, people are thinking of industrialization. And that's the way to go. Most of the people, look what is happening. Look what they are claiming. Now, contrary to the colonial pact, people are saying that we no longer export our raw materials. Our raw materials should be transformed here. If everybody concur on that decision and that option, things will definitely change. I have no doubt about that.
Waaw professeur dañoo seetlu ni jigéen ñi ñoom ñoo ko góor ñi question góor ñi ñoo ko góor waaw balaa maa ngi sama xarit bi am na benn jigéen bu war a posé question.
Non, na ko wax en wolof wala.
Before you come, I just want to give during one of our conferences, during one of our conferences, the professor made mention of the fact that they have started rewriting history of Zimbabwe. I want to know if there are any publications of those writings. If there are any publications of those writings.
There are volumes. These are all volumes. No, that is actually a good question, and I'm really, no, thank you.
And how possible maybe lay a hand on any of those publications for the benefit of the younger generation? Thank you.
Thank you very much for raising that issue. You know, you have here in front of you 19 books on the general history of Senegal. And right now in our computer, we have another 19 books on the general history of Senegal. But let me just remind you of something. This was not a national endeavor. This was not right at the beginning. He mentioned it. He was there with us, Professor Boja. And we have many scholars from Gambia that are part of our national, scientific committee. So this is a common goal. This is a common commitment, a common endeavor. We are all involved in. And I think French. But again, and maybe that will be the most optimistic note I can finish this this conversation. Translation is no longer a problem. Translation is no longer a problem. These books, and I'm telling you right away, we are working on two things. We are working on their translation, but we are also working on turning them into numeric, digital, in digital format. And if we turn them into digital format, the artificial intelligence can right away put it in English and even in Mandingo. And that is what is happening. Artificial intelligence is changing definitely the landscape of knowledge distribution. But there is a catch, there is a problem. Because what I experience with artificial intelligence is if the machine, if the computer doesn't know something, it invents anything to fill the gap. And that is happening in our history because we have a long period of our time we were trying to fill. But if you ask ChatGPT about the period from the it's a really empty period. We don't have too much information. We are trying to fill the gap. But if we don't do it, meaning if we don't mobilize ourselves, Gambian, Senegalese, and all West African people, to fill that gap, what will happen is the artificial intelligence will invent or reinvent another imaginary geography and fill that gap. And that is even happening in our language. I'm telling you. Do you know that? I don't know. You can experience that. I participated two days ago in a work, and we mentioned something really scary. Something really scary is happening. The artificial intelligence is speaking in Wolof. They are now using the Wolof language. But they don't know, they don't have all the wording. You know how they solve the problem? How the machine is solving the problem? They invent words that has nothing to do with Wolof. I'm telling you, I experienced that myself. They are inventing a new language. And look what will happen. If we are not doing our job, if we don't do our job, meaning working our language to make the reflect the reality of artificial intelligence will come and teach us a new Mandingo, a new Wolof that has nothing to do with our own language. I'm telling you, and that's happening. Okay.
Okay, good afternoon, colleagues, and good afternoon, Professor. Thank you for those wonderful briefing and lectures. Anyway, I just want to ask and compare between West African, this ECOWAS system, and the recent Sahel region, that the progressive development that is happening between these two sides. As we can see, as the Sahel region is more of progressive now than even the West African states. So what can you brief us, or what can you tell us in respect to these two divisions that happened recently? Thank you.
Thank you. I remember right at the beginning, I mentioned this silent transformation. You know, myself, what I experienced in regarding ECOWAS and the Sahel organization. There is something like a dividing line between the two organizations that can show in terms of the speeches, the political, the international stances, etc., etc. But here also, what is happening is separated, divided. But in the real deal, they are working together, cooperating on an economic level, on a fiscal level, and on a trade level. So the division is only factitious, but in reality, there is a real thing of a real cooperation going on. Don't get fooled by this rhetoric of division. Definitely. Thank you. I think, yeah. You want to ask? Oh, okay.
I just wanted to ask what you said about AI.
So you just want to ask something? Yeah.
My name is Esther, and I just wanted to ask what you said. You were saying that you were talking about the disadvantages of AI and how they are trying to replace new words that are not actually in our local languages. What I'm trying to say is that the disadvantage is that the younger generation that are also trying to learn these local languages are actually going to rely on technology because we all rely on technology. And they're actually going to think that those words are actually real. And as time goes on, our own local language is actually going to go extinct. And we, the people, because we'll grow and probably die off, it's going, people will now think that those languages do not exist. And that's how. My name is Esther, and I just wanted to ask what you said. You were saying that we are talking about the disadvantages of AI and how they are trying to replace new words that are not actually in our local languages. What I'm trying to say is that the disadvantage is that the younger generation that are also trying to learn these local languages are actually going to rely on technology because we all rely on technology. And they're actually what they're actually doing. And as time goes on, our own local language is actually going to go extinct. And we, the people, because we grow and probably die off, it's going, people will now think that those languages do not exist. And that's how we exist. And this imaginary history is going to be implemented.
That's true.
And that's how we become extinct.
Oh yeah, no, that's so true.
So we must be careful with AI.
Huh?
It's not totally reliable.
No, don't get me wrong. I'm not against AI. It's a wonderful tool. But remember, what kind of information are available for AI? It's the available information they got from the imaginary geographies of Europe. So it's up to us to give a content to those instruments, to those tools. And that's exactly what you guys are doing. Studying history, doing PhDs and masters, you are inventing new knowledge. You are inventing local knowledge stemming from our culture, from our history, and you will feed the AI. I gave one example. You remember right at the beginning, I was referring to Kafu, Lamana, etc. Those are not French or English words, but it's up to us to put those wording in the memory of the AI. For instance, Lamana. Lamana it was coined by the Senegalese linguist Patidjan. Talked about Lamana. Patidjan. Let's all be Patidjan. Inventing new concept, writing thesis, writing books, making arts, and filling the artificial intelligence with information we created ourselves, but not information we just consume from importation. But you are definitely right.
because then it gets to a point that we actually start believing that that is actually true.
That's true.
Because that's how so many languages become extinct.
That's
They no
true.
longer exist.
That's true. That's so true. So this is serious stuff, right? This is serious matter, and it's good. We are aware of those challenges.
Okay, Prof. I think another area which you and Prof. Ture need to work on.
We are already working together.
I know. It's for you to help us establish a department of archaeology in the UTG. This is the most reliable way for me for us to substantiate some of the emerging things.
Don't worry for that. We are on our way. We already signed an MOU. Yeah, we signed, and everything will go along those lines. Thank you very much, guys. A good picture will be there. As we are moving, clap for Prof for a wonderful presentation.